you just come. I'm working on it. Okay, distance direction. That's up.
This is me turning on my mic so you know I haven't disappeared. Setting up some fans. Getting comfort table, as the cool kids say. Oh, I forgot I wanted to start off this stream by just going, "Good morning, Vietnam!" Alright, we checked that off the list. Alright, let's get this music out of here. I'll get the music of war out of here. Let's go to the lo-fi that everyone uses. Is this it? Sounds like it. Sounds also too loud. Let's move that down to, I had like at 2. Might sound too quiet now, but the music gets fairly louder. This one? Shebang. Oh, yes. Yes, sirree. Radix reporting from the front lines, that's right. You with a knife and fork, what are these emotes? I don't know how what Twitch emotes are, to be honest. I don't know how Twitch works. I'm just here teaching history, man. You think I know how Twitch works? Every emote donates 1 bit to breast cancer research. Shows that. See, it's hard to tell with our sense of humor of whether or not that's a sarcastic comment or not. Okay, I got pizza with me. Ideally, I shouldn't be eating a pizza while giving a lesson, but you know, what am I, held up to educational standards on a Twitch stream? Alright. Today's topic, by the way, there's going to be a little incentive for those of you who stick around and watch the stream live, because at the end of the stream, if it just doesn't leave my mind, we're going, is it cheese pizza? It's pepperoni pizza. But at the end of the stream, I got a list of topics, and you guys get to vote on which you want to hear covered next, or, you know, suggest your own thing you want to be, you want to have covered. Oh, it's kind of weird because that sort of thing is you're voting. If you suggest something new you want to be covered, it's like you want to know something you don't know, and that can be hard to do because it's hard to figure out what you don't know. Yeah, it is. Wink, wink. No, it's not. It's not. It's not cheese pizza. It's not that pizza. God dang it. Alright. I'm never good at transitioning into beginnings. So let's just, I don't know, let's address the image I have up on here. These are Chinese soldiers that are serving as the background picture. And last episode it was just Dominica, since that was the subject, but these Chinese soldiers, you might notice, are female. I don't know how to alter the fabric of the universe through pure will. Can we learn that next? No. But you might notice that these Chinese soldiers are women. There'll be a interesting thing to note here as we look at some of these pictures, that because communist societies valued a sort of egalitarianism, women soldiers were just as, let's see, how do I phrase this? They were just as, just as viable for recruitment for frontline combat, that's how we say it, as any male soldiers. So both Vietnam and China would employ female soldiers during this particular war. And these girls are actually deployed in Vietnam. They're having the time of their lives, it looks, having fun. Who knows how many of them survived? That picture looks like a, yeah. Okay. Alright, so let me, oh, and I also have some news clips, but I'm doing them through, oh, is the music too loud? It looks kind of too loud on OBS. I have some news clips, but I'm using the OBS feature to actually like show a media clip. I don't know how much that's going to lag out the stream. When we get to that part, I'll play the whole clip even if it makes the stream so laggy it's unbearable. I'll be watching along on my phone to see how well it does. Any other introduction notes I want to make before we get into this. I only made this whole OBS setup like 4 hours ago. Alright. Let me look at my notes. Alright. Well, let's start off with some... Where is it? Start with some geography, so we know where we're talking about. Women are just as expendable as men. I guess, yeah, as a way of looking at it. Where's the map? Vietnam and China. Because one thing important when teaching history, especially to a very open audience like this, is it's important... I call it History 101 with Dr. Radix, because History 101 is an introductionary level class, and I don't want you to have like this catalog of knowledge before you go into the history subject. So I try to make my history lessons very accessible to those who don't know much about history or even geography. Where is the map? Okay, I have a lot of pictures on OBS, so forgive me if it takes me a while to find a picture. Okay, so here's where we're dealing with. Green is the People's Republic of China, and orange is Vietnam. Now, when we begin our story, Vietnam isn't going to be just one Vietnam. It's going to be two Vietnams. There's going to be North Vietnam and South Vietnam. In fact, in order to get the context of the Sino-Vietnamese War, it's important to note that Sino comes from the Latin root for China. So whenever you hear Sino, like Sino-Japanese War, Sino-Vietnamese War, the Sino-Soviet split, Sino refers to China. I have a catalog of knowledge, but very little of it has to do with history. Yeah, okay. At least we can recognize where we can brush up on some stuff. So, Vietnam's much smaller compared to China. Population's much smaller. Yada, yada, yada. Let's see. I am scatterbrained. I am sorry. I guess we start with... I don't know. Did you guys read the quick facts that were going by on the screen? Talking about how Indochina is the area of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and how it was controlled by France until like after World War II. Do you recognize that Chinese Taipei is a part of the People's Republic of China and is not a separate nation? Well, I think it will be a nice cold day when I recognize a part of land as being part of the People's Republic of China more than they already have. But yeah, the gist of it is Vietnam, Laos... Alright, let me zoom. So we were going to get to this later, but Laos... Do I have a little drawing thing? Yeah. Let me get... What's a good color? Let's do purple. So, this whole area surrounded in purple, and that's not how I wanted it to look or whatever, that was called Indochina. This Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. On this map, you see that North Vietnam and South Vietnam are divided. But that was all French territory. And then in World War II, Japan took over and gave the countries independence. Purple sucks. You know what? I'll fight you. Is this Laos? I don't know how to reply to that. But these are all French territories. World War II happens, Japan takes it over and then gives them independence as the Empire of Vietnam, the Kingdom of Laos, and the Kingdom of Cambodia. One of Japan's philosophies during World War II was to give independence to Asian countries that were controlled by non-Asian countries in the East Asia Pacific region. Now, after World War II, of course, Japan was defeated. And then France is like, okay, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, time to come home. And Vietnam was like, oh, well, Indochina was like, oh no, brother. And then they fought what was called the First Indochina War. And by the end of the war, the original communist insurgencies, and it's important to note that the communists were really the only people pushing for independence at this time, because communism has a strong anti-imperial doctrine. So, communism is really appealing to those who are under the occupation of foreign empires. But beyond that, besides like the head officers in charge, the most foot soldiers, the peasants, they really cared about kicking out the French and getting independence. They They might not have even known much. I'm holding a pizza, so that's the only thing in my brain. They might not have known much about things like wealth distribution, or property rights, or the abolishment of property rights, so to speak. What they really cared about was independence. If you read my China essays on the China reunification, the communists are sort of the same thing here. They wanted to kick out foreign influences in China because they were inspired how the Russian peasants overthrew their czar, and then they just sort of attached the parts of communism, such as anti-landlord type stuff, and they just sort of attached it because the anti-imperialism message seemed like a good idea. So now the communists were the ones really pushing for independence. When the First Indochina War breaks out, the Viet Minh under this dude named Ho Chi Minh, and I have a picture of him over here, Ho Chi Minh with Mao Zedong. Yeah, on the right's Mao Zedong, the leader of China. On the left is Ho Chi Minh. He has a long history that I might not get too much into here. But Ho Chi Minh led the Viet Minh, and after the war, ultimately it was decided that 4 countries would be established in Indochina. Laos and Cambodia would be given independence as the Kingdom of Laos and the Kingdom of Cambodia, and they would be supported by the French and the United States. After all, this is happening in the context of the Cold War. I hope I don't have to explain what the Cold War is, but the short form of it is, after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union are pretty much arguing, or what's the word I want to use? Struggling. They were in a struggle to see who could get the most influence over pretty much the entire world, because after World War II, you enter the age of superpowers, aka really powerful countries, and at the time it was only the United States and Soviet Union. Today, most scholars, you can make an argument for any country being a superpower, but most scholars accept that after the Cold War, the United States is the only superpower. And that from 1945 to 1991, it was the United States and Soviet Union. But the United States and Soviet Union fiercely opposing ideologies. Surprisingly, more opposing in the economic form than how the idea of governance. During the Cold War, this is very similar to World War II. The United States likes to look at World War II as a war between democracy and fascism. And they might have actually believed that when they were fighting the war, but when you actually look at the war, okay, the country you were fighting the second hardest against, Japan, wasn't really fascist. China was fascist, and yet you were allied with them. And then Spain was fascist, but you didn't go to war with them. And if it's a war between freedom against authoritarianism, where you still have China on one side and you still have the Soviet Union as a major allied power, World War II ultimately is just a really big war. It's very hard, once you look into it, to apply a sort of ideological crusade, almost glorification of the conflict on it. The Cold War is very similar. American perception of the Cold War was freedom and capitalism versus authoritarian communism. Now, capitalism itself wasn't really that the term capitalism wasn't used too much to refer to the United States during the Cold War. In the Cold War, it was mostly viewed during the time as a struggle between authoritarian communism, which were strongly linked together in the Cold War by the Americans, and American democracy. But when you actually look at it, even if the Americans believe they were fighting for freedom or democracy, it really is more capitalism. And you can see a lot of differences with a lot of, especially in like South America and Africa, or Latin America and Africa, you can see where there is a firm difference, or you can see that capitalism and democracy aren't always as tightly linked as the Americans might want to think they are. So ultimately it came to communism bad, America good, as far as doctrine of the United States was. So that's why you have the United States interfering in the governments of Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam, which they get independence after the First Indochina War, and America's like, alright, I'll support you. The communists had enough strength to establish a North Vietnam. Now, the North Vietnam was sort of supported by the Soviet Union. Because, again, the Soviet Union wants to spread communism. And to sort of push back capitalism. So, you have a Soviet Union-backed North Vietnam. Feel free to ask any questions, because I know I kind of sped through that. I wasn't expecting on talking about that, but once I started this, I felt it would be weird to just leave it out. So that's how we get this situation. Now, what do these colors signify? Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam are blue because they're backed by the United States. China's in red, but you might notice the Soviet Union over here. And if I scroll up, yeah, this is the Soviet Union, very big country reaching all the way to China. Mongolia, but we don't really need to talk about Mongolia. And North Vietnam are in a deeper red than... You're a dirty pinko? What does that mean? They're in a darker red than China. And we'll get to why they're in different colors, why I put them in different colors here later on. So we got the map. So, what more context do we want to talk about? Vietnam? The Vietnam War? Let's talk about the Vietnam War. It's napalm! That was my reenactment of the Vietnam War. So, you can argue about the starting date. But most people say in the 1950s, we have the Vietnam War. Or the Vietnam War begins. Now, there have always been efforts by North Vietnam to invade, I can't really draw good, but to invade South Vietnam. After all, it's natural to want to have your country as one country. Much like Korea, North Vietnam viewed itself as a legitimate Vietnam government. After all, they were the ones that secured their independence, while South Vietnam was backed up by the United States. Therefore, they viewed the South as a United States puppet. So, naturally, they wanted to unify the Vietnams. There were always also USA operatives in North Vietnam trying to destabilize the area. But, what really ramped things up was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where a United States naval fleet sailed too close to Vietnamese waters. It's okay, Radix, we know your degree isn't in digital art. Well, thank you for understanding. The United States ships flew too close to Vietnamese waters. Supposedly, North Vietnam attacked the U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. This sort of area is called the Gulf of Tonkin, which led to the United States deciding, alright, we're going to send more resources. And around this same time, when North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam, and that's how you get the Vietnam War. Pew, 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 pew. So, who was in the Vietnam War? And I don't want to... Most of this lesson is really going to be the context setting up the Sino-Vietnamese War, because the Sino-Vietnamese War happens pretty fast. But I kind of want to save a lot of these topics I'm going to talk about for, their own topic one day. Because I could go really into depth with Vietnam. But let's see. Let me check my map. I have different layers here. Vietnam, South Vietnam. So, what you have is North Vietnam moves in to attack South Vietnam. You get a lot of fighting in this area, and eventually it turns into guerrilla fighting. Now, China really wants dominance in the Asia region. After all, it's one of the most powerful Asian countries. And they see... I don't know if I want to jump into this real quick. We'll just say North Vietnam is invading South Vietnam. American forces are sent to support it. And you have a big war breakout, the Vietnam War. Now, that's 1955. Moving on to... the Vietnam War is also called the Second Indochina War. Okay, did we go straight into the Sino-Soviet split? Yeah. 1956, sort of just after a year that the Vietnam War broke out. China and the Soviet Union are not getting along. Get my pizza here. Now you might be saying, hey Radix, what do you mean Soviet Union and China aren't getting along? Isn't the Cold War the struggle between capitalism and communism? Both China and the Soviet Union are communists, right? They should be working together to oppose the American imperialists, man! Well, a problem has arisen within Chinese communism and Soviet communism. Essentially, it's all over Joseph Stalin. See, Joseph Stalin helped set up the Chinese Communist Party. Mao Zedong heavily wanted to, or strongly wanted to emulate Joseph Stalin. But the problem comes with Joseph Stalin's I'll put interpretation in quotes, interpretation, air quotes, of communism. Essentially, Joseph Stalin used communism as an excuse for him to have power. Joseph Stalin didn't really care too much about the actual doctrine of communism as much as he cared about getting power. He used his power very abusively. Many died. You know, the Stalin regime wasn't a good regime to be in. People disappeared. Quotes around disappeared. Now the problem is, so Stalin dies. And he's ultimately succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev. Now Khrushchev gets in power, and Khrushchev's a little bit more militant against the United States. You know, I've only ever heard good things about Stalin, is that true? But Khrushchev gets in power, he's much more hostile against the United States. The Cold War's in full swing. But there's the problem here, and that's the Soviet Union isn't doing so well economically, despite being the victor in the world's most massive war. Those wars tend to hurt the economy. But in combination with that, a fully 100% planned economy with a lot of famines, which, by the way, Russia has a history of famines even before communism. I just kind of want to make that clear. He was just a man who knew what he wanted and how to take it. Good guy, Stalin. I see. But yeah, the Soviet Union economy wasn't doing so well, and when the economy is not doing so well and you're the new leader of a nation, it's very easy to point fingers at your predecessor. It's even easier to point fingers at your predecessor when everyone hated him, because he would disappear your family in the middle of the night. So, Khrushchev ultimately comes to the decision that in order for the Soviet economy to succeed, we're going to have to open the door a little bit to a mixed economy. We're going to have to open a door to little zones where we're going to allow some sort of a free market economy and try to use that mixture to bolster up our economy for a little bit. Because if we don't, we are going to just collapse. And so he's doing that. Also, he's calling Stalin things like not a true communist. He turned his back on his people, so-and-so. Now, the reason this is a problem with China is because, again, Stalin helped set up the Chinese Communist Party, and Mao Zedong really wanted to emulate Stalin. Stalin was effectively Mao's hero, even though Mao sort of did a lot of things behind Stalin's back that Stalin didn't want him to do. See my essays on the reunification of China series, which, by the way, I'm remastering. I found some drafts, so I'm trying to collect them back into PDF form. It's just I don't have the pictures. So I'm trying to find all the pictures. Remake the pictures I made in the first place and find the pictures I was talking about beforehand. So Mao sees that Stalin's legacy is being spit on by the newer Soviet leaders. And he's like, oh no. The Soviet Union has kind of been like the propagator of communism in China. We keep a close eye on what the Soviet Union is doing. We sort of as like our big brother, and whatever changes he makes to the Soviet Union makes to the doctrine of communism, we'll make those changes too. But when you start yelling at Stalin and start saying this whole Stalin thing was a mistake, well, that gets rid of the whole foundation, the whole pillar that Mao Zedong stands on. And Mao's like, oh no, this isn't good. He also looks at it as a sort of... He looks at the Soviets opening up to a more broader mixture of a free market and planned economy and says, hey, you're actually planning on siding with a capitalist, aren't you? You're just revisionist. You're not true communist. In fact, I think you're going to side with the Americans against China. And there's a lot of factors that play into that, especially when you consider, Russian imperialism into northern China in like the early 1900s and stuff. So Mao, China and Russia have a deep history of distrust, and Mao's like, I'm going to call Khrushchev and the new Soviet Union revisionist. They are not doing true communism. Only Mao Zedong's communism is real communism. It's around here that Maoist thought really begins to diverge from the mainstream communism. A big, platform, not platform, a big, in Maoist thought, unlike your standard communist thought, standard communism, Marxist communism, tends to take the position that it's the industrial worker who is destined to rise up over the bourgeoisie. Maoist thought comes from the peasants, rural societies, as opposed to the industrial centers. And that, you can see how he got his thought when, when you look at the Chinese Revolution and see where all the Chinese communists came from. The peasantry, the fields. So, from this point on, you have what's called the Sino-Soviet split, where China and the Soviet Union are no longer a united front against America. I have a map somewhere. Mao, Khrushchev... Where's the map? Mao, Khrushchev, Ho Chi Minh Trail, Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, Cambodian skulls. Could have sworn I had a map. Well, the point of it is, every communist country has to choose between if they want to side with China or the Soviet Union. Now, seeing as the Soviet Union is the main propagator of communism, surprise, surprise, most people side with the Soviet Union. There are two exceptions. Albania and Somalia both side with China during the Sino-Soviet split. The reason is because Albania and Somalia both really were in the same boat as Mao in the fact that they really valued Stalin. So this whole separation between the communists comes with, the what's the word? Dislegacy, the dishonoring of Stalin. I mean, it's hard to dishonor Stalin, to be honest, but so Somalia and Albania join China. Everyone else goes with Soviet Union. One exception is North Korea, which is very quiet about this. North Korea obviously agrees with the Soviet Union, but North Korea relies on China for so much stuff that it's like, I'm not going to say anything, man. But yeah. Now, one big deal is North Vietnam. North Vietnam is supported by the Soviet Union. When the Sino-Soviet split happens, North Vietnam sides with the Soviet Union. And now China's in a very unfavorable position because, again, it wants to dominate this sort of Asian area. And right now, it looks like the Soviets are getting the most... The Soviets are starting to get more influence. They're the ones fighting the Americans, so China's like, that's not good. I'll show the Russians. Even though the North Vietnamese government is backed by the Soviet Union, I'm going to help my own communist group try to fight South Vietnam. I'm going to train peasants to rise up against the South Vietnamese government, and this is the birth of the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong, I have a picture of them somewhere. We have the North Vietnamese Army, the professional army of North Vietnam, and then we have the Viet Cong, the peasant that China trained. Soviets supplied and backed North Vietnamese Army. People's Republic of China trained peasant, Viet Cong. Believe it or not, the Viet Cong was a huge thorn in the side of the Americans and South Vietnamese. But the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong would work together very closely, even though they were backed by two forces that had opposing interests. Let me check the map to see my notes, where we talked about the Vietnam War breaking out, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, United States is fighting in the Vietnam. As the war continues, the Soviet Union and China struggle to gain the strongest influence over Vietnam. You know, even though the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army are working together, China and Soviet Union are still kind of saying, I want influence over Vietnam. No, I want influence over Vietnam. We already talked about the Sino-Soviet split. Now, the Sino-Soviet split, I talked about the ideological concerns, but really, the big thing about the Sino-Soviet split is how it's ultimately, there are three big powers in the world: the Soviet Union, China, and the United States. And if you want to win a Cold War against the other, two of you guys have to be sided against the other guy. Now, the way you want to take out China is by the Soviet Union and the United States working together, which is how China thought the Soviet Union was doing. To take out the United States, Soviet Union and China need to work together. And to take out the Soviet Union, the United States and China need to work together. Please, I'm trying to learn about communism. So that ultimately will be more important than the ideological stance, because if you remember from like 15 minutes ago, Mao accused Khrushchev of like, you're just trying to side with the West. You're not doing real communism. China's eventually going to do the same exact thing, but the Sino-Soviet split will still be there. So the ideological differences are important at the beginning, but then it's sort of more a practical thing. More of a practical, realpolitik type deal. I also want to point out that after the Sino-Soviet split, the Soviet Union mobilized their forces to be on the Chinese border pretty much at all times. So you had a huge devotion of Soviet troops to the Chinese border. Deeming the Soviet Union as revisionist, China and the Soviet Union begin to split. In reality, the Sino-Soviet split can be seen as a Chinese effort to preserve their legitimacy. While Mao Zedong was leading China through a Stalinist model, Nikita Khrushchev began to denounce Joseph Stalin. Mao saw the Soviet idea of peaceful coexistence as a move to isolate China. It's a whole lot of red. Yep, that's the name of the lecture, isn't it? Red versus red. North Vietnam sides with the Soviet Union. Alright. Any pictures I need to talk about that I have? We are talking about the Vietnam War, Viet Cong, North Vietnam. Okay. The Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, if you look at the map of North and South Vietnam, you might notice that there really is only a small bottleneck. Where's the paint tool? There's really only this small little border that the forces can cross. North Vietnam, even with the Viet Cong being annoying over here, North Vietnam's having a hard time to just straight up invade South Vietnam when you have a strong South Vietnamese, United States, and even some South Korean forces stationed and holding them back. What North Vietnam wants is to just walk around the border and then just destroy, because keep in mind the South Vietnam capital is somewhere in this area. They want to just bypass it, just walk around the border, and then take the capital. But the problem is, there's a Laos and Cambodia here. Specifically, the big thing is Laos. There's a Laos there. You can't just cross into another country. Or can you? Because the Ho Chi Minh Trail is planned, which literally is just that. A secretive road, network of roads for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong to cooperate and bring in North Vietnamese forces into South Vietnam. So how are you allowed to just send forces into another country? Well, let's just start a civil war, man. Laos enters a civil war in 1959. It's you have the American-backed Kingdom of Laos, and then you have communist forces rising up. Because there are a lot of communist influence in this area, as you can tell. So, the civil war breaks out in Laos. Laotian monarchists, supported by the United States, fought against Laotian communists, supported by North Vietnam. as the North Vietnam and Viet Cong seek to create the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a trail in Laos that would allow North Vietnamese forces to flank and sneak into South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese, like almost the year the Civil War breaks out, the North Vietnamese overthrow the Laotian government and establish a communist ally as the Ho Chi Minh Trail is established. So Vietnam actually makes very short work. Even though they're like tied down in Vietnam against the Americans and South Vietnamese, they raffle stomp the Laotians and almost immediately establish a new Laotian government that's sympathetic to the Vietnamese cause and also allows the trail, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, North Vietnam invading Laos and creating a new puppet government effectively is going to be really important later on, even more than just the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Because you'll slowly see that North Vietnam is kind of wanting to establish a Vietnamese empire. They haven't even taken South Vietnam yet, but it's looking like they have aspirations to unify all of Indochina underneath the North Vietnamese flag. Cambodia is getting worried about this. And this will all tie into why China invades, trust me. 1966, the Sino-Soviet split has completed. Soviet forces on the Chinese border. Alright. So, in Cambodia, a communist organization rises up called the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge, I think I have a nice little picture. Ho Chi Minh, yes. The Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge rise up in Cambodia. They're another communist organization. They're led by a man named Pol Pot. P-O-L-P-O-T. Now, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge sort of allow... Not the North Vietnamese army. Get out of here. Ho Chi Minh Trail. There it is. The Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot allow the Ho Chi Minh Trail to extend into Cambodia. If you look at the map, you might see there is a very small area of Cambodia where the Ho Chi Minh Trail crosses over. That's protected by the Khmer Rouge. The Cambodian government is still backed by the United States, but the communist rebels are allowing the North Vietnamese to pass through. Around this point, the United States just starts bombing Laos and Cambodia because, hey, there are Vietnamese troops in there. But whatever. Now, the Khmer Rouge will become a problem in 1986. Not 86, 68, 1968. That's when the Cambodian Civil War breaks out. Let's put the Khmer Rouge back up there. So the Khmer Rouge rise up against the Kingdom of Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge are supported by China and North Vietnam, while the United States backs the Kingdom of Cambodia. Yes, I forgot to mention, the Khmer Rouge are backed by China. Unlike North Vietnam and Laos, well, Laos now, who are backed by the Soviet Union. China looks at Cambodia as the only non-Soviet area in the region, besides, South Vietnam, I guess, but it's going to be hard to take over South Vietnam when there's a huge war going on there. So China looks like the only way they can start to get hegemony in the region is to overthrow the Cambodian government with a pro-Chinese government under Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. So the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian Civil War breaks out. Now, 1972, something important happens. Because if you remember, Soviet Union and China are not getting along. Well, bam. 1972, United States President Richard Nixon visits China. He's the first head of the American state to visit a leader of China since World War II, I guess. Franklin Roosevelt and maybe Harry Truman were close with Chiang Kai-shek. Eisenhower actually met with Chiang Kai-shek, but by that time he was just in Taiwan. But Mao Zedong finally meets an American president, Richard Nixon. Why? Well, I'll tell you why once I finish eating this pizza slice. Because at this point, the Cold War is ramping up. Richard Nixon has realized what we just talked about, how that the only way for this Cold War system of three superpowers to work is if two of them unite against the other one. Nixon realizes that if he wants to take out the Soviet Union, he needs to be allied with China. And so starting in 1972, you have Nixon doing this whole diplomatic campaign that ultimately leads to China and the United States becoming buddies. And they kind of remain buddies up until the end of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. If you ever heard of the movie, the 1980s movie, I think it's 80s, Red Dawn, not the new one, but the old one. Red Dawn has the Soviet Union invade the United States, but if you listen to the dialogue, who else is helping the United States? China. China is actually supporting the United States against the Soviet Union in the movie, and I think it started off as a book, Red Dawn. And to us living in 2018, you might be like, why is China helping us? Aren't they both communist countries? But it's because of the Sino-Soviet split. China and the United States had much better relations when put into the context of going against the Soviet Union. Now, sacrifices are made here. Because throughout this time, the United States had been recognizing the Republic of China, aka Taiwan. I believe it's on this map. Yeah, Taiwan over here, near my head. That's where Chiang Kai-shek's government went. They had been recognizing Taiwan as the true Republic of China. Taiwan had a seat at the United Nations Security Council and not the People's Republic of China. During this whole diplomatic revolution, the United States recognizes that it really needs to get close with China, and in order to get that close relationship, sacrifices are made. And so, the United States withdraws its recognition of the Republic of China, and instead says the People's Republic of China is the true government of China. And very soon afterwards, the United Nations Security Council seat that Taiwan had is moved to China. And the photograph you're looking at right now is the first People's Republic of China delegates to the United Nations who are now recognized as the proper China state and are now in the Security Council, and they're literally laughing like supervillains. It's amazing. But yeah, that's the cost of this closer relationship with China. Richard Nixon visits China. United States President Richard Nixon meets with Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. He also meets with Mao Zedong, as you saw with the picture, being the first American president to meet with a Chinese head of state since the end of the Chinese Civil War. In order to band together against the Soviet Union, China and the United States revolutionize their relations as China and the United States begin to work closer together. The United States eventually stops recognizing the Republic of China, and Taiwan will lose its seat in the United Nations. They're just having a great time, aren't they? Now, 1975. And for those of you who know your Vietnam War history, you know what that means. You know that we have lost Saigon. Let's go back to the war map, because some things have happened. The way the Vietnam War ends is the American public are so pissed off at the war, and it's gone on for so long, that the United States just goes, alright, let's just sign this ceasefire. And we're going to sign this ceasefire. You know, North Vietnam will be in North Vietnam, South Vietnam will be in South Vietnam. The end. You don't have to make it complicated. And North Vietnam's like, oh, okay, that's cool. And the U.S. is like, okay, that's cool. And now, because of the hippies, we gotta go. Our people need us. And so America goes off, withdraws. And South Vietnam's like, oh no, and then North Vietnam's like, surprise, I lied, and then invades right around the time where Nixon is involved with the Watergate scandal, so the United States is kind of distracted. The Watergate scandal's going on, North Vietnam just blitzes South Vietnam, and, you know, sort of crushes the South Vietnamese army. We can just delete that layer entirely, and then, you know, here's a picture of Saigon. The United States starts evacuating people because they know once North Vietnam takes over South Vietnam, anyone who worked with the Americans or the South Vietnamese government are going to get killed. So they start helicoptering people out up to the United States Navy off the coast. so many Vietnamese people in South Vietnam just get on rafts and just start leaving with the idea of going to the United States. Most of Vietnamese people in the United States today either come from or are descended from the generation that were refugees from South Vietnam. At the end of the war, bam. Well, that's not what I thought would happen. Oh, because of the thing. Take two. Bam. South Vietnam is now North Vietnamese territory, which ultimately Vietnam unifies, so now I can stop tripping myself up by saying North Vietnam and South Vietnam. This is now just Vietnam. North Vietnam was actually called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, but once they become one Vietnam, they call themselves the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Now here's a little problem. So now that the Vietnam War is over, we can finally see who won out between the Soviets and the Chinese, who are arguing over, who wanted the influence in the region. Now here's the thing. One of these guys... one of these guys is a professional army of the government that took over South Vietnam. The other guys are peasants who are just fighting a guerrilla campaign. Once North Vietnam takes over, the Chinese-backed Viet Cong just kind of go back to their civilian lives. It's the North Vietnamese army that wins out. The Soviet Union has won the little sort of influence war that China has been trying to get control over Vietnam. So now you have North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and Laos all under Soviet-backed... Oh, that's a very unfortunate picture. That's a very unfortunate outline. That's all Soviet-backed Vietnamese territory. Now China's like, oh no, I'm losing territory. I'm losing influence. I did not expect that to happen. But China's like, I'm losing influence in the region. I'm familiar with this map strategy. That worked out too perfectly. So China's panicking, but have no fear. Cambodia is here. Vietnam War ends as North Vietnamese forces seize Saigon, and resulting in a rushed American withdrawal from Vietnam, with Vietnam unified and the Social Republic of Vietnam is declared. By the way, I like to note that I know my notes, and I just only check them to see if I miss anything, but for the most part, I'm not reading my notes. I just know the notes. I have an outline. My current history teacher for the Cold War, he literally writes a script, walks in and just reads the script, and then we're done. Like, are you really teaching that point? Like, yeah, he writes the essays, but he just walks in, he has the essay printed out that he wrote and just reads it. It's a weird system. I didn't think you could get away with that. But we finished the Vietnam War. Now the Cambodian Civil War, which I mentioned was happening, it finally ends with the overthrow of the American-supported Cambodian government, and the China-backed Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, proclaims a new country. They've overthrown... Let me get the China colors, because this is China-backed. They overthrow the Cambodian government and declare that this is now called Democratic Kampuchea. They renamed the country from Cambodia to Kampuchea. Porqué? I don't know what I mentioned that he said porqué. But yeah. The Kingdom of Cambodia becomes Kampuchea. Let me spell it out for you. Actually, I think it's pronounced Kampuchea. I'll be honest, I have only heard this word spoken in the Animaniacs Wacko Warner's Every Country in the World song, because it was still called Kampuchea during that time. But Cambodia gets renamed to Kampuchea. Democratic Kampuchea. Or Kampuchea. And Pol Pot's now in charge. Now, once Pol Pot gets in charge, He's kinda insane. Democratic Kampuchea? Yes, that Kampuchea. This is a piece of slice. It's better than that last episode where I was starting to get numb from how hungry I was. Now it's time to talk about the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot's reign. This is what Pol Pot's idea is. He wants to make Cambodia, or Kampuchea, great again. He wants to purify the country. Basically, he idolizes a period from the year 802 to 1431. There was a country called the Khmer Empire, or the Cambodian Empire, where Cambodia pretty much ruled a lot of the area. Make Kampuchea great again. So he wants to go back to the Khmer Empire, and the Khmer Empire was largely agrarian, very much agricultural. And in order to understand this, the sort of pre-agricultural revolution, that agrarian society is kinda the most egalitarian time period humanity has ever seen. There were really no gender roles. Gender roles didn't really start to pop up until the agricultural revolution. Everyone was pretty much equal. It's once we start building civilization and society that things get messy. So he literally wanted to go back to a time before civilization was really properly a thing. So he mobilizes a majority of his entire country's population and puts them in labor camps. He mobilizes a vast majority of the entire country's population and puts them all in labor camps. It is something that we really haven't seen done before or afterwards. It's this amazing atrocity. Now, with that, he also begins a genocide in order to purify the Cambodian population. Here are some of the peoples he targets. He targets those involved with the previous regime, the Kingdom of Cambodia. He targets those involved with any foreign governments. He targets those who aren't ethnically Cambodian, which means really big targets. There are three main targets of these ethnic areas. Ethnic Chinese, ethnic Cham, who are mostly Muslims, and ethnic Vietnamese. He believes in a strong atheist state. He begins to genocide anyone who has any religion in any form whatsoever. Christians, Muslims, and a lot of Buddhist monks are just... A lot of Buddhists, too. I'd like to remind you that Cambodia is like in peak Buddhist land. Ultimately, most of his population fits the criteria for being killed. So, how did he think this was going to be a good idea? Let's kill off a large percentage of our population and put the rest in labor camps. I don't know. Most people were brought to the killing fields, where they were literally just brought and shot. I have a picture of one dude just killed. Genocide. Yeah, I have this picture labeled "Genocide in Action." Just take them all and kill them. Here are some skulls of people from the genocide. Here's some photographs of some prisoners who will later on go on to be genocided. At the end of the day, 1/3 of the entire Cambodian population are dead. Let me just reiterate that. 1/3 of the entire country's population is dead. We're reaching levels of genocide previously thought impossible here. Like, Jesus. Oh, a lot of teenagers were hired Democratic Kampuchea recruits thousands of desensitized, conscripted children in their teens to commit mass murder and other atrocities. Ultimately, through a very interesting psychological experiment, Pol Pot discovered that children can be pressured into doing anything if you, go really hard on them enough, including shooting down their own parents with an AK-47. So, a lot of the people killing the people in Cambodia are children who are bullied into killing their own parents, desensitized, conditioned, and then pretty much turned into Pol Pot's little army of murderers. The Cambodian genocide, in my opinion, there are two rules that most history associations hold. The first one is don't question the Holocaust. That's like the first rule they teach you. You're not allowed to do that. But the second rule is to don't compare tragedies. But if I'm being honest, I think this is definitely one of the worst genocides in all of history. Maybe not the worst, but I am hard-pressed to think of something worse. Especially considering that this happened from 1975 to 1979. 4 years. It happened in a period of 4 years, and 1/3 of the population is dead. Now, if you remember, Cambodia is supported by China. Pol Pot is supported by China. If you remember, ethnic Chinese are one of the targets of the genocide. So many Chinese people are killed in Cambodia. So what does China do? China sends, I have the number somewhere, China sends 15,000 Chinese soldiers to Cambodia to help the Cambodians with the genocide. China sends 15,000 soldiers supporting the genocide, but also sort of preparing. Ultimately, what China's worried about is the Soviet-backed Vietnam, which at this time controls 3/4 of Indochina. So China sends the forces to Cambodia to sort of train the Cambodian soldiers because they expect a war with Vietnam to break out soon. They also help in the genocide. China does not protest the killing of ethnic Chinese. China just sits back and watches people of their own ethnicity being genocided in another country, and they don't, not only do they not say anything, they send 15,000 soldiers to help kill them. It's really bamboozling to me what's going on here. The Cambodian genocide's just insane. They're not with us. Let's see. Democratic Kampuchea, Cambodian genocide. One more group of people who I forgot to mention got targeted in the genocide. Any military personnel who were trained by Vietnamese personnel. Now, if you remember, with the whole Cambodian Civil War and the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Cambodia and Vietnam were tightly linked. So that means also a good chunk of the Cambodians who fought to establish this new regime get killed as well because they were trained by Vietnamese. So, yeah. Ethnic Vietnamese, anyone trained by Vietnamese, killing fields, 1/3 of the population, desensitized teenagers. Kampuchea greatly here's the relations between Cambodia or Kampuchea and Vietnam. Kampuchea greatly distrusts the Soviet-backed Vietnam, especially with the end of the war. They fear that Vietnam plans on establishing an Indochina empire with Vietnam as the head, based off of the North Vietnamese occupation of South Vietnam and Laos. As you can see, Cambodia is the only country in Indochina that's not Vietnam at this point. China provides Kampuchea with 15,000 military advisors who both support the genocide, China does not protest the genocide of Chinese people, and provide military assistance for a conflict against Vietnam. Kampuchea begins small-scale raids and firefights with Vietnamese forces on the Cambodian-Vietnamese border. So at this point, the Cambodians are starting to cross the border into Vietnam and are just doing little raids. Vietnam kind of puts up with this for a little bit because they know if Vietnam goes to war with Cambodia, you're putting the entire world on a road to war between China and the Soviet Union. Because it's sort of like a World War I situation, where if you declare war on someone, their bigger ally will come in, and then your bigger ally will come in, and then it's going to be ugly. Vietnam knows that it will declare war if it declares war on Cambodia, China will declare war on Vietnam, and then the Soviet Union will declare war on China. At that point, you have two nuclear powers at war with each other. That's not a good thing. So Vietnam holds off pretty much as long as they could until 1978, and they're finally like, okay, you're crossing the border every now and then and doing raids. You're wiping out our people in Cambodia. We can't handle this. We can't let you keep going with this. So, as Kampuchea continues to strike Vietnam and kill ethnic Vietnamese, Vietnam decides to invade Kampuchea to overthrow Pol Pot and end the Cambodian genocide, and put in place a pro-Vietnamese Kampuchea in order to prevent further conflict. Another goal is to put more Soviet power in the region rather than the Chinese-supported Democratic Kampuchea. So, what that looks like is Vietnam just like, I'm tired of this, invades. Ultimately, they overthrow Pol Pot, the Cambodian genocide comes to an end, and Cambodia is occupied by Vietnam. Quite literally, Vietnam has established an empire on Indochina. They do eventually replace Democratic Kampuchea with the People's Republic of Kampuchea, which is a Vietnamese-allied, Soviet-backed Kampuchea regime. Vietnam doesn't bother to rename the country back to Cambodia, but whatever. So they do that. By the way, the teenagers that were going around killing everyone, they continue a resistance for about a year until they're finally wiped out. Cambodia is just a mess at this point in time. But now, the alarms are going off in Beijing because China, the China-backed Cambodia just got occupied by the Soviet-backed Vietnam, and now the dominoes begin to fall. January 8th, the People's Republic of Kampuchea is established in Cambodia by Vietnam. The United Nations still recognizes the Democratic Kampuchea as pro-Khmer Rouge forces continue armed resistance. Chinese spies begin to probe northern Vietnam. And then, on February 17th, 1979, the Sino-Vietnamese War begins when China invades Vietnam. Now, I do have a news report, a live news. The problem is, I don't know if my internet can handle this. Like I said at the beginning of the stream, I'm going to try to play this. I'm going to try to play it in its entirety, but it might get really laggy. But I'll play the news clip. So, if it gets really laggy, just hold on. I'll play the whole clip, and then let me get my phone ready, because I want to see if this actually works. I'm also going to mute my mic so you guys don't hear my stream on my phone. So you guys don't hear let me try to play it.
In a Radio Hanoi broadcast tonight, Vietnam admitted Chinese troops are advancing. Several provincial capitals are threatened. Already 2 major Vietnamese towns are said to have been overrun, plus a string of villages along the 500-mile border. As the two communist nations battle, President Carter's been busy determining what the U.S. response should be. White House correspondent George Strait reports.
Official U.S. policy toward the conflict in Asia was developed at a morning meeting here at the White House between Secretary of State Vance, National Security Advisor Brzezinski, Vice President Mondale, their staffs, and the President by phone from Camp David. At that meeting, 4 principles were decided upon. First, the U.S. will not become directly involved militarily. Second, the United States will use any diplomatic leverage it gained during Vice Premier Deng's visit here to encourage the Chinese to pull out of Vietnam. Third, we will try to get the United Nations involved in coming up with a solution to the whole Southeast Asian problem. And finally, our allies in the region, namely Thailand, will be protected. But few believe Thailand is in any immediate danger. What all of this means is that U.S. officials are now in a holding pattern, waiting to see what happens in Asia before any American action is contemplated. White House officials concede that intelligence reports that they've received so far indicate that there is a real possibility that the Soviet Union will respond militarily to the invasion of its ally Vietnam by China. But few expect that response to be massive, and no one here has any fears that that response will lead to a superpower confrontation. George Strait, ABC News, the White House.
This is Bob Brown. Chinese news broadcasts have shown none of the current fighting, only scenes from past skirmishes along the border with Vietnam. But diplomatic sources say 2 district capitals have fallen to the Chinese, and 12 villages in 4 provinces have been overrun. Radio Hanoi claimed Vietnamese defenders had inflicted heavy casualties and disabled nearly 60 tanks, but also admitted that 2 provincial capitals were threatened. The Chinese greatly outnumber the Vietnamese, who are fighting back with civilian militia. Many of Vietnam's best troops are in Cambodia, where they helped overthrow a regime that was friendly to China. Today, the new Cambodian regime signed a peace and cooperation treaty with Vietnam. China's loss of its Cambodian alliance, coupled with Vietnam's strong ties to the Soviet Union, apparently convinced the Chinese that some assertive action had to be taken. Now, the Soviets are studying their options.
Агрессивные военные нападения Китая на Вьетнам.
This is one of several meetings the Russians say were held in factories and universities to demonstrate solidarity with Vietnam. Pravda said the Soviet Union will honor its recent treaty with Vietnam. The treaty is not, however, a military alliance, and the ultimate response of the Soviets may depend on the extent of China's actions in Vietnam. China has suggested its invasion is punitive, that its troops eventually will return to guard the frontier. The United States, says Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Frank Church, should stay out.
These are communist governments fighting one another. If they are determined to fight, then I say let them fight. We don't have to be the center piece of every war that comes along.
In areas close to the conflict, the apprehension is greatest. Thailand's Prime Minister Shamanan has just completed a U.S. visit to meet with administration advisors. And despite U.S. reassurances today that Thailand will be protected, he issued a statement to say, "We want to ask one thing. Just don't get us involved."
I think it just
Bob
ended with
Brown,
you guys,
ABC
so I'm
News.
still listening here.
Besides worrying her neighbors, China's invasion of Vietnam could further complicate deliberations in Washington over the naming of the first U.S. ambassador to Peking. The U.S. and China have agreed to exchange ambassadors by March 1st, but new debates in Congress over Taiwan's safety will likely be fueled by China's attack on neighboring Vietnam. This could delay the confirmation of Ambassador-designate Leonard Woodcock.
Still listening on my end. Hold on. Okay. So, that was the news report. Now, you might have noticed that America doesn't seem to really want to get involved in this war. Now, why would it not want to get involved in this war? Could it be that the Vietnam War ended 4 years earlier? I'd like to remind you that this is happening only 4 years after the Vietnam War ended. Vietnam hasn't caught a break yet. So, it's very interesting. But yeah, Chinese forces over in Vietnam, let's pop that up. The Chinese begin to, where's the tools I want to use? They begin to push into Vietnam. They really start to, hit the north. Now, if you listen in the news report, by the way, that actually went better than I thought it would. I thought it was just going to lag out the entire stream, but it actually went pretty well. If you notice, they said that most Vietnamese forces are in Cambodia, meaning that small militias had to pop up. And that's true. Militia forces, Vietnamese militia forces recruited straight off the bat once China invaded, were the main opposition against Chinese forces. Because the main Vietnamese troops were set up in Cambodia. Those Chinese must be strong swimmers, just marching to the... I didn't want to have to do the... to break down each little flag and have to... Let's have these guys taking the north. Really, I'm not sure they pushed this as far as this second flag is being put, but whatever. So, they're invading. Now, at the same time, there's very much a huge worry about the Soviet Union. So what China does, even though China's sending a lot of troops... Let me get rid of these Americans. Let me get rid of the Americans. Even though China's sending those troops into Vietnam, it's not really most of their forces, because most of the Chinese army, I think about 1,500 soldiers. I'll check the numbers when I look at my notes. They were posted on the border with the Soviet Union because they were expecting the Soviet Union to move on in. Let me just get rid of these Americans. Radix 2018. So as you can see, we're in a bit of a pickle here. Also, another reason the United States doesn't want to get involved with it is because if they get involved, that the only way they can really involve themselves is intervening against China. But if you remember, China and the Americans are kind of not exactly bros, but they're in friendly relations now. For all intents and purposes, the United States is aligning with China in this war. I like to remind you that this war started because Vietnam wanted to stop a genocide that was going on in Cambodia. But how dare they, am I right? I am curious, once this is all over with, to just sort of poll the crowd and see, who would you support in this war? Who do you think was in the right? Vietnam or China? So let me keep that question in mind as we go through. Let me check my notes. Or let me see if I have any pictures to show. Pol Pot, Cambodian skulls, genocide, Nixon, fall Saigon. So we have some photographs from the Sino-Vietnamese War. As you can see, the main photograph behind me is female Chinese soldiers in the Sino-Vietnamese War. And here are Vietnamese soldiers in the Sino-Vietnamese War. Rather, these are more like, suddenly recruited militia. I would say militiamen, but as you can see, they aren't men. As I said earlier at the beginning of the stream, both China and Vietnam sent women to the front lines. Okay, now that's clipped. Let's get rid of these Americans. I have one last piece of pizza. Now, I'll be honest. As an American, there's sort of a hurt pride in the fact that America couldn't win the Vietnam War against a bunch of peasants in sandals in the jungle. But seeing, even though they were kind of close to us now, close to us then, China of today is definitely not close to us. So there's some sort of schadenfreude when you see China just having so much trouble with Vietnam. They are getting ambushed. Most of the northern side is landmined to heck. The Vietnamese are employing guerrilla warfare tactics, and the Chinese are getting their butts handed to them. China can't afford to send in air forces or naval forces because they don't want to escalate the situation with the Soviet Union too much, because at the end of the day, no one wants a nuclear war. But also, Vietnam has really good anti-air defenses. Landmines, ambushes. The jungle is ridiculously hard ridiculously difficult terrain. It's just the schadenfreude of seeing the Chinese struggling with the Americans, just repeating the same mistakes Americans made just 4 years earlier. There's just some schadenfreude in that. What you see here is a Chinese tank that isn't really good at maneuvering Vietnamese terrain. These Chinese soldiers are tired after being ambushed and facing combat after combat. Now here are some Vietnamese prisoners. You know who's Chinese by looking at the prison guard's hat, because that's the most like Maoist type hat you can think of. There's another photograph of Chinese prisoners with Vietnamese. Now, it sucked to be a prisoner if you were Vietnamese and you were a prisoner to the Chinese army, man, gotta suck for you. But the Chinese soldiers who got captured by the Vietnamese soldiers, oh boy. I'm sure we all know the horror stories of Americans being tortured by Vietnam during the Vietnam War when they get captured. I gotta be honest, that front soldier looks like an action figure. Yeah. It sucked to be a prisoner, you know? Yeah. But if you are a Chinese prisoner in Vietnamese hands, you know, Vietnam... It was only 4 years after the Vietnam War. Vietnam still employed the tactics of torture they used there. There are a lot of reports of Chinese prisoners just being all messed up because they were prisoners by Vietnamese soldiers. So it's just the schadenfreude. Just seeing it all, just seeing them repeat the same exact mistakes, but being even more pompous about it. Because they're the great China. They can't possibly mess up. We pushed back the Americans in the Korean War, don't you know? We conquered Tibet, don't you know? So yeah. The Chinese have a terrible time. Oh, some names. The Sino-Vietnamese War is also called the Third Indochina War. The Vietnam War is called the Second Indochina War. China, an interesting thing with East Asian countries is they always name wars ridiculously. Vietnam calls the war the War Against Chinese Expansionism. Because, very much so, China's expanding into Vietnam. The Chinese call it the Defensive Counterattack Against Vietnam. Now, they call it the Defensive Counterattack because Vietnam invaded Cambodia. Now, you might say, but China's clearly invading Vietnam. How is this still a defensive counterattack? Well, because Vietnam invaded Cambodia. Wasn't Cambodia doing a genocide and launching little raids into Vietnam? Wasn't Vietnam being defensive with the invasion of Cambodia? You might be able to say that, yeah. so really, the Chinese name of defensive counterattack against Vietnam is just ridiculous. Let's see. Chinese forces invade and capture several Vietnamese cities in the north. China deploys most of its troops, 1.5 million, to the Sino-Soviet border. Let me get that map back up. Anticipating the Soviet Union to come to the defense of Vietnam. So here's what here's why this doesn't turn into World War III. The Soviet Union is against the war, but it cannot defend its ally, Vietnam, as it cannot afford a war with China. The Soviet Union is also on the precipice of war with Afghanistan. If you know where Afghanistan is, you can see the Soviet-Afghan border. At this point, the Soviet Union's planning its invasion into Afghanistan. So they're like, we can't put all our resources into Afghanistan and then fight all of China over Vietnam, too. Could you imagine being bogged down in a war in Afghanistan and Vietnam at the same time? We already called the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan the Russia's own Vietnam. Dude, I love the lectures. Well, thank you. Words of encouragement will help encourage me continuing this series. How long have I been going? I've been going for pretty long. Let me try to wrap this up. So ultimately, the Soviet Union does nothing. So Vietnam is left to take on the entirety of China by itself, while maintaining an occupation of Cambodia. China's ultimate goal is for Vietnam to withdraw their forces from Cambodia and move them up to the front lines to help defend Vietnam, meaning China can move in, bring back Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, and re-establish democratic Kampuchea. However, Vietnam's like, I'm not going to let Hitler too come back. So Vietnam keeps their forces in Cambodia for the entire duration of the war. The problem is, China's like, you're not bringing your soldiers out. But Vietnam has a history of knowing how to fight an extremely much more powerful military using only peasant militiamen. AKA, hey, we literally just did this 4 years ago against America. No, don't wrap it up. All right. I try to stay conscious of people's time when I stream. This will be re-uploaded to the Radix repository. While Chinese deploy professional forces, Vietnam is forced to defend itself with mostly militia due to the deployment in Cambodia. The Chinese are torn to shreds due to Vietnam's terrain and Vietnamese guerrilla warfare tactics. Ultimately, China does push up to Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam, but at this point they realize this isn't worth it, man. On March 6th, China pushes all the way to the capital of Vietnam, Hanoi. However, Vietnam still refuses to withdraw from Cambodia, and Chinese forces continue to take heavy losses. China ultimately says, China backtracks here. They realize that, I have 3 hours to drive, oh man. China realizes that Vietnam's just not going to pull the troops out of Cambodia, and that China's ultimately losing the war because Chinese soldiers are dying left and right. So China just decides to rewrite the rules of the game. China changes, they previously were like, we want Vietnam out of Cambodia. Now that it looks like that's not going to happen, China says, we were just doing this to punish Vietnam. We pushed all the way to Hanoi, and we just really wanted to scare the Vietnamese by pushing up to Hanoi. But now we can withdraw. Mission accomplished, guys. It just China's being that dude like you play you play around a basketball with, but he keeps like changing the rule. Like, I guess a better example would be like if you're playing Uno with a group of people and someone like says you have to call Uno between when you put the card from your hand to the table, and then like when they call you out on it. Like, they just changed the rule of the games in the middle of the game. It's like, we did what we needed to do, mission accomplished, and then they leave. They freaking leave. China pushes its way to Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam. However, Vietnam still refuses to withdraw from Cambodia, and Chinese forces continue to take heavy losses. China declares that the mission was to punish Vietnam for their invasion of Cambodia, and that their mission, since they had reached Hanoi, had been achieved. So now they begin to withdraw. That was really annoying. Yeah, it was. I have another news report. We have two news. We have a scarce double upload. So let me get to that news report.
In a Radio Hanoi broadcast tonight.
The Chinese invasion there has supposedly ended, but the Vietnamese appear to be taking no chances. We have a first-hand report from Hanoi from ABC's Jim Laurie.
The Chinese invasion lasted 27 days. It was a poor man's war. Little else but infantry and artillery were used. The Chinese set out to teach Vietnam a lesson. But here in Hanoi, the only lesson Vietnam appears to have learned is to wage a better battle next time. While most analysts have called it a war no one won, Vietnam is hailing it as a victory. This rally organized to prove it. Behind all the celebration, though, we found here a sense that Vietnam needed to bolster national morale. Rallies like this, said one diplomat, are what keeps the machine going. It helps people forget the nation's troubles, its faltering economy, the war's devastation. This is where the Chinese invasion ended 100 miles from Hanoi, 11 to the China border. The Chinese may have stopped here, but with their devastating firepower, they left no doubt in Vietnamese minds that they could return at any time. If Vietnam was not sufficiently prepared then for the Chinese attack, it is preparing now. As far as the eye can see, trenches are being dug along the hills north of Hanoi. Militia and local forces bore the brunt of the Chinese attack. Now they are being replaced by regular army divisions. After more than 30 years, the Ho Chi Minh sandal has yet to be retired. Vietnam again is on a war footing. In the city, it's general mobilization. Rooftop anti-aircraft guns, not used since they downed American bombers, are being reactivated. In parks around town, everyone is taking military training. And so, while many may see the Chinese withdrawal and the prospect of negotiations as positive signs, the Vietnamese see them as reasons for heightened vigilance in a land where war seems almost a permanent condition of life. Jim Laurie, ABC News in Hanoi.
I'm still listening over here. Alright. So that was the wrap-up news report. So, if we go back to the map, Chinese forces withdraw. You also have to keep in mind that China doesn't want to drag this war on, because if they do, it increases the likelihood of the Soviet Union joining in. Now, immediately after the war, there is still going to be border conflicts between China and Vietnam, because they actually haven't agreed on what their border is. They're going to keep fighting over here for a while. They're going to keep fighting until the Cold War ends. On March 16th is when the last of the Chinese forces crossed the border back into China. Border skirmishes between China and Vietnam continue. This ends the Sino-Vietnamese War. Because China changed their goals for victory, China claims victory in the war. However, because Vietnam held on to independence as well as their influence over Cambodia, Vietnam also claims victory. Personally, I think Vietnam won. I mean, yeah, clearly won. But don't tell Chinese people that. In 1989, so almost 10 years after this fight, Vietnam finally pulls out of Cambodia, and it finally renames Cambodia from Kampuchea back to Cambodia. It goes from the People's Republic of Kampuchea to the state of Cambodia. And then later on, Vietnam asked the United Nations to handle Cambodia. So let me find United Nations blue. That's as close as I'm gonna get. So that's not what I wanted at all. The United Nations takes over the world. The United Nations takes over Cambodia, and I believe Cambodia is the first entire country the United Nations has occupied. But Vietnam says, all right, it's 1989, so the Cold War is starting to die down. Vietnam's like, all right, Cold War's over. The Soviet Union's on its last don't know what that was. The Soviet Union's on its last dying breath. I'll ask the international community to decide what to do with Cambodia. They let the United States occupy Cambodia. The UN forces occupy Cambodia for about 2 years, overseeing a democratic transition, and ultimately Cambodia is restored as a normal country with a democratic process. Let's see. Laos and Vietnam are still communist countries today. However, Vietnam and China still absolutely hate each other. Vietnam might be the most pro-American communist country there is. And I know Americans don't know about this war between China and Vietnam, so it might be surprising to hear that Vietnam is actually fairly friendly to the United States these days. Vietnam doesn't really have too much of a problem with the United States. I mean, sure, they're throwing some jabs about us being capitalist and too materialistic, but ultimately Vietnam prefers the United States over China. Vietnam just simply hates China after, China invaded it. And also there are more historical ties, because Vietnam and China have always had a poor relationship. So then we go to 1991. The Soviet Union collapses and the Cold War ends. So we can actually un-Soviet Union the Soviet Union here. I think Mongolia also gets democratic around this time. We can take out the entire Soviet army on this Chinese border. So now the Cold War is over. With the Cold War over, there is no Sino-Soviet split, because there is no Soviet. For there to be a Sino-Soviet split, there needs to be a Soviet. I guess you could say China won the Sino-Soviet split in the long run because China still exists and the Soviet Union doesn't. But now Vietnam is no longer supported by the Soviet Union, and Vietnam and China begin to. It's not until like 1992 that China and Vietnam finally start to normalize relations. They finally set their northern border. Yeah, this is around the time Cambodia gets independence. They set their border. Vietnam still doesn't like China, but still, a lot of people still don't like China. But that brings an end to the Sino-Vietnamese War. Very interesting. I guess I'll ask the question that I said I was going to ask. Who do you support in the Sino-Vietnamese War? Would you support China, or would you support Vietnam? Well, technically, in the historical context, the United States was supporting China during this. However, I kind of look at it and see that, Vietnam got rid of possibly one of the worst genocides in history and got invaded for it. Even though it's literally just 4 years after the Vietnam War, I personally think Vietnam was in the right, or the closest thing there is to a right in this war. If you want to put it in terms like that. That's just my opinion, though. Feel free to have whatever opinion you have. But I asked, the question last time over... What was it I asked? Over if whether or not that FBI agent was really an FBI agent or a KKK agent. I'm gonna try to engage the class. What do you guys think? Has he done eating pizza yet? That doesn't answer my question. Do we have people in here? Twitch says we have 4 viewers, although Twitch sometimes bamboozles me. Where's the stream at? Oh, no. I support Ethiopia. Okay. Alright, so I don't know how many people we actually have in the chat that are engaged. Like I said at the beginning of the stream, I had a little thing where anyone who stayed through the stream could pick what topic we cover next. Or we'd vote on what topic to cover next, but I don't know how many people are in here. Where is my list? Okay, I have some list of topics I might want to cover. I'm just going to pull the chat, see what you guys think. First and foremost, I'm asking for recommendations if anyone has any topic they recommend that they want to hear talked about. I have pizza now, I see. But as for the list of topics, one topic is... No one was in the right, but Vietnam wasn't too in the wrong, I guess. Okay. The National Socialism versus Fascism, talking about the difference between those two ideologies. The Boshin War, which is pretty much Japan's civil war, happens around the same time as the American Civil War, and it ends with the Japanese Empire being created. The 7 Years' War, sort of a world war that was fought with muskets. Government by Assassination, Japan, 1932 to 1936. This will look at Japan's domestic politics from 1932 to 1936. A lot of people getting assassinated, fascism trying to take over. From learning from this time period, you'll see why Japan wasn't fascist during World War II, and what separates them from fascism. The Korean War of 1871, the first American engagement in Korea. The United States fought against Korea in 1871. We could talk about that. I could redo the Reunification of China series in this sort of stream format. That would definitely be a series of streams, because that was a lot of information. And then modern Middle Eastern history. Honestly, the Modern Middle Eastern History series would be a series, but it'll also probably be the most useful information for people in the modern world, because not a lot of people understand what exactly is happening in the Middle East, and that series would tackle that. So, again, if anyone has any recommendations, just in general, feel free to throw them out there. Otherwise, some topics I have in mind is National Socialism versus Fascism, the Boshin War, the 7 Years' War, Government by Assassination, Japan in 1932 to 1936, the Korean War of 1871, the First American Engagement in Korea, Modern Middle Eastern History, or the Reunification of China. The Japanese Civil War sounds interesting, the Middle East. Alright, we have one vote for, number one option or. What does number one option mean? As far as I can see, one vote for the Boshin War, one vote for Modern Middle Eastern History. Anyone want to throw out another thing out there, or anyone want to throw a tiebreaker out there? Where did my lo-fi go? I had lo-fi. There it is. Is OBS not reading it? It's fairly quiet right now, though. Dreadcore in a different color says Middle East. Alright, I think we're going to flip a well, Japanese Civil War is going to be a one-shot. That can be done in one lecture. The Middle East will be a series. I just want to... Let me think of which I want to do. It'd be kind of weird to have people waiting like an entire Middle Eastern history series for the Boshin War. We'll do Boshin War and then Middle Eastern history. That's the plan as it is right now. I will reserve the right to not do that just because I'm scatterbrained, but as of right now, tentatively, the plan is next week, same day of the week, Thursday, 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we're going to be doing the Boshin War, the Japanese Civil War that ended with the creation of the Japanese Empire. And then after that, we'll be beginning our Middle Eastern History series, our Modern Middle Eastern History series. Japanese Civil War, but I'm worth more vote rise because Dreadcore is 3/5 an American. Boshin War, I spell it right? Yes, you did. Alright, that's the plan. Thank you guys so much for coming out. Without you guys, this series would not exist. Thank you to everyone watching this archive stream on Radix Repository. Feel free to leave a comment letting me know you watched it so I know there are people watching this on Radix Repository. Yeah, see you guys next week. And now we're arguing about the American purity of Dreadcore. Okay. Thank you guys, and have a good night.